Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into something fascinating. Autistic temporality.
Yeah, it's a deep topic.
Definitely. And our dive today is based around this really powerful piece by Jaime Hoerricks, PhD, called It Takes As Long As It Takes, and That's Okay.
A great title.
Isn't it? So our mission really is to unpack this idea that autistic time isn't, well, it's not a deficit. It's not wrong.
Right.
It's a fundamentally different way, maybe even a richer way of experiencing life. And it really challenges that, standard linear idea of time we all have.
Absolutely. Prepare for some surprises.
Okay, so let's unpack this. The author starts by talking about being labeled late, right from childhood. Late to speak, late to play,
Yeah.
late to mature. But the point wasn't just being behind schedule. It was more like resisting a time frame that felt totally wrong, mistimed.
And that's key, how the author immediately flips that late narrative.
Exactly.
Yeah, it really is striking. Because from the get-go, autistic people are often seen through this lens of, well, delay.
Missed milestones.
Right. Missed milestones, lagging development, that sort of thing. But the source argues these aren't just observations. They're temporal verdicts.
Verdicts. Wow.
Yeah, verdicts handed down by a system that demands everyone fit into this one single linear path of development. It's like the system itself sets these premature expectations.
Okay.
And, there's research, like Poole and colleagues back in 2022, showing there isn't some universal deficit in core timing tasks among autistic adults.
Even if they report difficulties themselves.
Even then. Which really makes you think, well, maybe the issue isn't some internal problem. Maybe it's the narrowness of the developmental gaze itself, as the source puts it.
So, okay, if it's not a deficit, what is the author actually suggesting is going on? What are we seeing?
Well, here's the really powerful claim they make. What they call delay may, in truth, be divergence.
Divergence, okay.
What they call falling behind may, in truth, be a rhythm that moves through spiral rather than line.
Spiral, not line.
Yeah. That pauses where others press forward, that blooms not on schedule but in season.
Blooms in season. I like that. So given this sort of inherent difference in experiencing time, it makes sense that external systems would clash with it, right?
Absolutely.
These systems impose this really rigid linear time. Things like the age of majority, the school year calendar.
Quarterly reviews.
5-year plans.
Yeah.
The source actually calls them architectures of control.
That's a strong phrase, but it fits. Because in areas like education, medicine, public policy, time really does become this disciplinary force.
Disciplinary? How so?
Well, for autistic people whose own internal rhythms don't match up with these external institutional schedules, the consequences can be pretty significant.
Yeah, I can imagine.
They're not just seen as out of step. They get marked, managed, sometimes even medicalized for it. Think about those age-based benchmarks.
Like sitting up by 6 months, talking by 18 months.
Exactly. They seem neutral, right? Just guidelines. But they actually function as tools of compliance.
Tools of compliance.
Yeah. And there's this framework, the Power Threat Meaning Framework, or PTMF. It helps us see how just categorizing someone can turn into a whole threat narrative.
A threat narrative.
Yeah, where difference gets framed as risk and delay gets framed as danger. It ends up questioning someone's basic worth just because they don't conform to the timeline.
Wow. That leads into something else the source mentioned that really caught my eye. Temporal gaslighting. That sounds intense.
It is.
What does that actually look like, in practice for someone trying to navigate these systems?
Well, imagine being constantly told to hurry up while at the same time people are accusing you of being too slow.
Oh, that's a contradiction.
Right. Or just being told flat out that your experience of time, how you perceive it, is just wrong.
Okay, I see.
And empirical studies like Casassis and others in 2018, they do back this up. They show that autistic time perception is qualitatively different.
Different how?
Not necessarily impaired across the board, but divergent, especially when it comes to higher order stuff like estimating longer durations or planning.
Which explains why imposed timelines feel so off.
Exactly, why they can feel so dissonant, so jarring. Think about things like individualized education programs, IEPs.
Right, in schools.
Yeah, or transition plans for adulthood. They're often structured around institutional timelines. Like, funding runs out when you turn 22.
Ah, so it's about the system's clock, not the individual's needs.
Precisely, not the person's actual rhythm or developmental path. The source uses this really sharp analogy. These plans are like schedules, train timetables masquerading as life paths.
Train timetables.
Wow. And the punchline is, if we derail, it is we who are blamed. Not the map, not the rails, not the system that never saw us coming.
That hits hard. Okay, that really clarifies the problem with imposed time.
Yeah.
So let's shift. What's the alternative the author presents? This idea of recursive temporality. It seems to challenge our basic assumptions about how understanding even works. The source says, consider how understanding might arrive later, maybe years later.
Yeah, not in the moment itself.
Right. Like the quote, when I relive a moment years later and finally understand it, I am not behind. I am returning as the story's rightful teller.
I mean, I've definitely had moments like that, haven't you?
Mm.
Where something just clicks years on.
Oh, absolutely. That resonates. And that's what this recursive temporality is getting at. It describes this non-linear way of processing things.
So time isn't a straight line.
No, it spirals, echoes, loops back on itself. Understanding comes in the return, in the revisiting.
Can you get an example?
Sure. The author mentions things like, a gesture once overlooked suddenly becomes a revelation, or a phrase heard in childhood resurfaces with new meaning decades later.
Oh, okay.
It's not about being slow. The source calls it nonlinear coherent sense-making through time as re-entry, not departure.
Re-entry, not departure. I like that. And it's not just a feeling or an anecdote. There's research, like Wallace and Happy from 2008, that actually found strengths in autistic individuals accurately reproducing time durations.
Strength.
Yeah, possibly linked to things like heightened perception or detailed visual memory, which really pushes back against that standard view of autistic time being somehow flawed or deficient.
Okay, so this isn't just about how the brain processes milliseconds then. It sounds bigger. Is the author saying this is like a whole different way of knowing things?
That's exactly it. This recursive temporality, it's not just some cognitive quirk. It's presented as a distinct way of knowing, almost a form of epistemology.
Epistemology, how we know what we know.
Right, and it forces us to rethink narrative itself, not as just A happened, then B, then C, but more like a field we move through and maybe circle back through.
Okay.
So for autistic people, the idea of narrative sovereignty, owning your own story, it doesn't necessarily start with putting things in strict chronological order.
It starts somewhere else.
It starts in reclamation. The right to go back, revisit, reframe things, name the meaning that maybe wasn't obvious the first time around. It's about refusing what the author calls the tyranny of closure.
The tyranny of closure. Allowing insight to take its time.
Exactly. Honoring that long germination process.
This connects to another really profound idea in the piece. Slowness as an ethical stance, not as a failing. The quote is just beautiful. Slowness, for many autistic people, is not the mark of dysfunction. It is the shape of care.
It really reframes it, doesn't it? And this slowness, it shows up in different ways.
Like how?
Well, slowness in speech and processing and change, or slowness in making decisions because all the variables matter. Taking everything into account.
Yeah.
Slowness in forming relationships because honesty cannot be rushed. It's not about inefficiency. It's described as deliberate, a way of moving with the world, not just rushing through it.
Moving with the world.
And this sense of time, this slowness, it often seems tied up with sensory and emotional depth.
How?
Well, there's research, Nazari and Yagudi in 2016, that found autistic individuals often misestimate time intervals when there are emotional stimuli involved.
Interesting. What does that suggest?
It suggests that, for many time, is kind of porous.
Porous.
Yeah, like it's easily influenced. It can be inflicted by affect, swayed by emotions. It can be disrupted by sensory load, too much noise, too much light. And it can be stretched or collapsed by what matters, personally. Time isn't fixed.
So what looks like distraction to an outsider?
Might actually be depth. What looks like lag might be attunement.
Okay. So if we connect this back to society, the source says this kind of attunement makes autistic people feel incompatible with the temporal machinery of modern life.
Right. That relentless pace.
So what kind of refusal is this slowness then? What's it refusing?
Well, it's not just refusing speed for speed's sake. It's also refusing what speed excludes.
What does speed exclude?
All that soft data, the things that don't easily fit on a timesheet or a progress report. The slight tremor in someone's voice, the flicker of a thought that hasn't been fully formed yet, the meaning held in a silence.
Ah, the subtleties.
Exactly. And the source brings in these really evocative terms to describe this more responsive, alive kind of time. Things like crip time.
Which comes from disability studies, right?
Yeah. Reimagining time outside of normative productivity. Then there's mythic time, unschooling time, garden time, spiral time.
All suggesting different rhythms.
Different, more organic rhythms. And embracing this, living by this different clock, It's framed as an act of sovereignty.
Sovereignty.
Yeah, not only over one's schedule, but over one's very way of being. It's like declaring that presence matters more than pace.
Presence over pace. That's powerful. And this idea of temporal sovereignty, does it also help us understand those patterns that are often seen as problems? Like, the source talks about a pattern of rupture and return.
Pausing, shutting down.
Yeah, maybe vanishing from a classroom or a job or even friendships for a while. Things often labeled as inconsistent or, unwell.
Right. And the source just completely challenges that interpretation.
Yeah.
It says, this isn't malfunction, it's method.
Method.
Yeah, these aren't failures. They're necessary reconfigurations. They can be gestures of refusal against a pace that doesn't work. Or intervals of becoming, times needed for internal shifts.
Okay. Is there research backing that up too?
Well, studies like Jones et al.
Mm-hmm.
In 2014 and Stevenson et al. In 2016, they show really wide variability in how autistic people estimate time, especially under emotional or sensory stress.
Right. You mentioned porous time.
Exactly. And also sometimes narrower windows for integrating information from different senses simultaneously. What this means, practically, is that autistic people do not always inhabit a shared present, with neurotypical people operating on a different temporal frequency.
They're not always synchronized with the external world's timing.
Right. The world often demands everyone be on the same beat, but their synchronicity might just operate differently.
So, if these perceived breaks or interruptions aren't failures, what are they? What positive role do they play?
The source uses this wonderful metaphor, like compost, fallows, underground germinations.
Letting the ground rest.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It suggests that stepping away, leaving a room, going silent, even abandoning a project that isn't working, that might be the most necessary act.
Not avoiding life.
No, but living it on a time scale that does not map cleanly onto external expectations.
Okay.
And the author shares this really personal insight about how moments of just seemingly doing nothing were actually the most formative for them.
That makes sense. Sometimes you need that space.
Yeah, and how this very piece of writing we're discussing, it's recursive itself. It took years to actually start writing, but the process had already begun long before, in the hush of a room a decade ago.
Wow.
They emphasize what they call stuck was a turning inward towards soil. And this amazing line, I do not write in Chronos, I write in Kairos.
Chronos versus Kairos. Linear time versus opportune moments.
Right. Which brings us sort of full circle, doesn't it?
It really does. The core message seems to be this powerful declaration from the author. I no longer chase their clocks. I name my own seasons. It really hammers home that autistic time isn't about being on time or marching forward predictably. It's about claiming sovereignty in our time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it helps to revisit those terms. Chronos, that's the rigid linear clock time, the time that measures worth by speed.
Okay.
Kairos, that's more about the quality of time, the right moment, the opportune time, more generous.
Right.
But the author actually takes it a step further. They end up reclaiming time not just as Chronos or Kairos, but as a landscape.
Time as landscape. What does that evoke?
Well, it's not a line you travel along. It's described as layered, lived in, echoing with the footsteps of those who came before.
Wow.
The past was not behind but beneath, folded into the stones in the soil. That's how the author says they move, attuning to openings, waiting for the ground to soften, navigating this terrain.
That's a completely different way of relating to time, not as something to conquer or manage.
Exactly. Which leads to that final, really incredible statement.
Yeah, what was it?
What I claim is not Chronos, not even Kairos. What I claim is a right to dwell in my own unfolding.
To dwell.
To move through time not as commodity, but as kin.
Time as kin, not commodity. That's a powerful thought to end on.
It really is.
So maybe the question for you listening is this. How might reimagining time, not as a thing to be bought or sold, not as a race, but as this rich, layered landscape, maybe even as kin, how might that change how you perceive your own unfolding, your own pace, and your own path?